Welcome to Everyone Deserves Sunshine. I'm Diana.
And I'm Anusha. We're the girls in the crease.
Did you miss us? I missed us. I missed you, Anusha. I haven't talked to you in, since a couple days ago.
Yeah, I missed you too. I missed our podcasting. I did. I have to say that.
It was nice. All right, well, we're ready to go and we are back.
This is a very, very full episode, and I hope this is something that'll be super interesting to our listeners because it sure was for us. This is episode 11, and today we're talking about identity.
Joining us today is Dr. Tabitha Dell'Angelo, a professor of education with a focus on developmental psychology and the author of Why Heated Rivalry Captivates and What It Teaches Us About Identity. We're talking about Shane Hollander.
So I'm in the esteemed company of two educators this time, two teachers. Is that what's happening to me? Great. So I then have an idea for how to frame today's episode because we need a lesson plan. What is the fundamental question we are answering? I think the question that I'd really like Dr. Tab to answer through the lens of Heated Rivalry and Shane Hollander, because that's what we do here, is not how we become who we are, but how we become why we are the way we are.
I like that. Look at you. You did your homework. I wanted to go back to our original question that we ask everyone because I want to know because I don't know. How did you get into the show, Dr. Dell'Angelo?
So the origin story. So this is really, I was hoping you would ask me the origin story. So I was listening to The Daily. And so I listen to The Daily when I get ready every morning, except for Monday mornings, I listen to your show. And truthfully, they were saying they didn't really like TV in 2025. There wasn't much that they liked, but they liked Heated Rivalry. And I hadn't watched it, and I love TV. And I was like, how have I missed this? So they talked about what it was and that it was about hockey and, they all the things. And it sounded really good, but I hadn't watched it yet. And then it's like the holidays and I'm super busy or whatever. And then we all went out to dinner and you two got into it about Heated Rivalry and the themes and the this and the that. And I was really excited because I already had heard about it and thought I need to put this on my list. And then after hearing you all talk about it and how excited you were about it, I thought, okay, now I have to watch it. And so that was my story.
I'd like to kind of take it a step further and ask, what made you write this piece? This piece which says why Heated Rivalry captivates and what it teaches us about identity.
This is just the way I think all the time. So ever since I learned about Bronfenbrenner in particular, so this is the ecological systems theory that we're going to be talking about today, that was such a big part of my graduate school. It was like all we did, that everything I watch, I apply these theories to. It become just the way I've learned to understand the world. And so it's just what I do. It's just how I think. And so many of my friends are really interested in Heated Rivalry and my students, right? So my students are also talking about it, that I thought, this is a cool way to get my students to learn this theoretical framework because they're thinking about characters that they are interested in. And so it was just like another way, like really a teaching method to be like, okay, here's a way for you to learn about this complex theoretical framework because we're going to be applying it to characters who you love.
Wait, walk us through this. What did you say?
The ecological systems theory, right? So if you think about just like ecology, just in general, right? If you think about your garden and you planted a tree and one side of the tree gets a lot of sun and maybe the flowers bloom more quickly and the other side of the tree is shadier and maybe it doesn't get as many leaves or flowers or whatever. That's the ecological system, like in the natural world. And so this theory, it's Urie Bronfenbrenner. So basically what he said was we can apply a systems theory to figure out the why of people, right? And how everything is influencing each person's development. So when you see this theory, like if you Googled it and you did an image search, you would see something that looks like a target. And in the center is the individual, is the person. And then there are these circles that go out just like a target that literally mimic the influences like in proximity. So the immediate system is the microsystem includes the individual, but it's like your family, your school, like the systems that you interact with every day. And then it goes further out to even things like local government and media and socio-political context. And so it's really
Oh.
complex, but it's also really simple in a way because it's just acknowledging that your identity is really influenced by so many factors and that it's fluid. And so there's another part of it that's called the chronosystem, which is basically over time. So if we
Mhm.
think about like a person's development, I know we're talking about Shane today, but like Ilya, like how old was he when his mom died? Like if you lose a parent at 5, that's different than losing a parent at 15 or 25 or 50, right?
Right.
And so the chronosystem also has an influence on your development.
Mm. You know how I always thought about them? Like, I always look at the system and I see them as like a target too. But in my mind, I always also think about them as nesting dolls because I'm like Russian nesting dolls. You know, you have like the little
Yeah.
micro and then it gets bigger and bigger. So I like the way I like thinking about it in that way too. Makes it more fun for me anyway.
But it also makes sense, right? Because if you had the nesting dolls, if they're all nested, if you shake the big one, it
It
impacts
all shakes.
every
Yeah.
level, right? And so it does it works. It works.
So
Yeah.
then let's talk about Shane as the individual in the
Mm,
first system, which is the microsystem. And that microsystem basically says, who am I, right? Who is with me? Like, who
Mhm.
are my direct influences? And, you know, Shane carries a lot of different identities, and none of these identities exist in isolation. Like, you can't really understand one without the other with him. And you can't understand any of them without understanding the world that he exists within. So, Dr. Tab, do you want to talk about the microsystem and all of Shane's, you know, closest relationships within that microsystem? So that's the teeniest, tiniest, closest system to Shane.
it's the closest
Mhm.
system, but, and that could change too over time, right? So, like, if you were a kid, we might be thinking about school, but at Shane's age and the age that we know him, we're thinking about work, and his work is his hockey team. He's Japanese Canadian. I think his mom Japanese Canadian and his dad's
Mhm.
white Canadian. So he has these intersectional racial identities. He's got probably, I'm guessing, like the pressures of an Asian kid, an immigrant family. Then he's got his teammates, his coaches, like all of that is going to impact on him. Also his I think his autism is something to consider in his microsystem because it's going to impact the way he approaches the world. So all of that is impacting his immediate system. And what you see in the beginning, which is interesting, like even in terms of the relationship with the chrono system, and I missed this first time around. You and I, like, we got into this a little bit. I didn't realize the first time I saw the series, the span of time
Mm.
Mm.
that was covered. Like, even though I watched it all, I sort of in my mind, my schema was like, this was 2 years, but it was so many years. And I
Yes.
think that his age is also an important variable to consider because when you become notable and maybe even have a lot of money or whatever at 18 or 19, like that's amazing. But also, like,
Mhm.
that's a lot to handle for like a kid. And
Yes.
basically, he's still a kid. And so I think all of that, in his microsystem is, like his world of like family and friends. And his parents seem super supportive, but his
Mhm.
dad's a former hockey player, so we know what he wants. We see his mom being very ambitious about his sponsorships and things like that. And then his
Mhm.
friends, his teammates, like, are they tight? Like, he does have that one friend. I forget his name,
Hayden.
the one with the kids.
Hayden.
Yeah.
Mhm.
That seems to be like his closest friend relationship. Um, but but mostly and maybe because of his neurodivergence, he's a little bit of a lone wolf, right?
Mhm.
So in terms of, like, support systems, I don't see a lot. I don't know that he needs a lot, but in his microsystem, his closest relationships are probably his family's, like, the best he's got.
Mhm.
And Ilya,
Yeah.
right?
Well, and Ilya
Ilya's part of it.
eventually. Sure.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
but not initially, right? And then the other thing with Ilya is it's a secret, right?
Mhm.
So it's
Mm.
when he texts, they have to use pseudonyms. They don't live near one another. Um, they're not always accessible to one another. So, so that could be, yeah, that's definitely part of his microsystem, but maybe a little like maybe not the most supportive source, at least initially.
It's funny to me because, and I think I mentioned this to you and Yusha the other day, that like we in the show, you know, obviously Shane has had many influences prior to the show, right? Like he's 17 when we first meet him.
Uh-huh.
But in the show, we never see him without knowing Ilya. Like the first
Right.
time we ever see both of them on screen, they meet each other. So we have no
Right.
idea what he's like without Ilya in his life in some way, shape, or form, whether it's secret or, eventually not. So I think that's really interesting. And I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, Bronfenbrenner also says that like it's not just about like the people you're interacting with in your microsystem or the events that are taking place within those interactions, but it's also the response to those events that also shape why you are and who you are, right? And shape your identity. And I think a lot about, specifically when I think about the microsystem for Shane, I think about the coming out scene
Mm.
between him and his mom, right? And I always think that the way, when he comes to her and he says to her like, I'm sorry. He's apologizing for something he thinks she needs to hear from him, right? But the way she responds to him by saying like, "You have nothing to be sorry for. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I made you feel like you couldn't come to me." Like I think that interaction, right? Because again, like the response to that event is shapes the development. I think that interaction really what becomes like the foundation that Shane then builds his like future self on.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, so much of identity is collusion, is like
Mhm.
the way in which we respond to one another. And so
Mhm.
that coming out scene is really interesting because, like you said, Shane sort of did this buffer. I'm sorry. Like he's not totally sure how his mom's going to react. And his mom could have done a million things. She could have
Mhm.
said, how have you never told me this before? Why didn't you trust me? Like she could have said, "Yes, I'm cool with this, of course, I love you," but also made him feel guilty. Like, she could have done a million things, but what she did, you're right, gives him the strength to be like, she's got my back. I'm gonna be
Mhm.
okay." And so then
Mhm.
his emergent identity as, like, potentially, like, a proud gay man is so much more possible because of that.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, that's a great point.
To me, that scene, like, is the bookend to a scene that happens in the first episode where, Yuna is telling him, "Remember, kids look like you don't often see themselves where you are." She's likely talking about the fact that he's Japanese Canadian, um,
Mhm.
and that's clearly such a core element. The way he responds to her, it sounds like a conversation they've had a lot of times. The way
Mhm.
he's like, "Yeah, mom, I know." He's heard this before. And he's like really made that something that is like a core feature to him.
Which is a lot of
Because
pressure.
yeah, a lot
Yeah.
of pressure, right? But what does that mean? What he interprets that is like being the hockey
Being who
player
he's
that doesn't
supposed
make
to be,
yeah,
right?
supposed to be the hockey player that doesn't make waves, that is like the
Mm.
perfect poster child, essentially.
Mhm.
That's how he
And
interprets it.
it's a lot. I mean, a lot of I think a lot of people of color in particular, deal with this because they carry the burden of reinforcing stereotypes of, like, their whole group because
Mhm.
that's how our culture, operates, and so that is a lot of pressure for him to think, "Okay, I'm the Asian guy. If I step out of line, then, like, what if, like, all Asians get painted with this
Mm,
brush or
Mhm.
or Asian kids don't see themselves as wanting to do that. Like it is a lot of
mhm,
pressure to be burdened with the idea that like you alone are the torchbearer for your group. What you guys are talking about is really kind of in the mesosystem. So the
Mhm.
mesosystem is
mhm,
this like messy middle where
mhm,
the microsystem, the exosystem interact, right?
Mhm.
And so this is this area where it's the connections between the levels, right? So like how does the family and hockey interact? Like how does his private life and his work
Mhm.
life and his public persona, how do they sort of collide with one another and support one another, or sometimes not support one another? I think it was like that with Rose, right? So like the everybody in the public eye was like, "Yay!" And
Mhm.
there like, I could imagine him being like, "Oh, this is what people want, and I want to please people." So,
Yeah.
like, that's a lot of pressure.
Tab.
Yeah.
Part of your evaluation or analysis about Shane and the mesosystem, and yes, we're still at the mesosystem, was, and I think this is like really important, the difference between his, or the interactions or the conflict between his private world and his public world. And I think
Mm.
that is part of the mesosystem that I'm almost most interested in, especially when it comes to Shane's character, because he's so different in public and in private.
I mean, I just think that
Very
it
good,
is,
yes.
that's a lot of emotional labor to carry when your public and private life is very different.
Mm.
Mhm.
And, we see it, obviously he's like really in the public eye, but it's like that for lots of people, who might have very serious, home life happening, but like you got to go to work and do your job,
Mm.
or go to school or whatever it is. And I think that that's what we see with him is that, he's carrying this, but then he still
Mhm.
has to get out on the ice and perform. And he still
Yeah.
has to show up and do commercials and smile and be the person who, makes a full articulate sentence in an interview. And, it's a lot to carry. And I think that over time, if you're not able to integrate those things, it it could result in like, poor health outcomes.
Yeah.
Luckily we didn't see him have to carry this for too long and but
10 years though, that's a
ten
long
ten
time.
years, yeah. No, it's
Like your
true, yeah.
formative years too, like
But
17 to, yeah.
yeah, and think about like how many people never like live their whole life in the closet. They
Mhm.
don't come out,
Yeah.
right? Or they I mean, being a professional athlete is a good example of a job where you're unlikely to come out. If
Right.
he had a different kind of job, maybe
Right.
maybe he wouldn't have been in the closet. We don't know. And but that also relates to, again, the chronosystem, because we happen to, this is set at a time when there's a little bit more acceptance of LGBTQ people in Canada, not necessarily
Mhm.
in that sport, but in Canada. But on the other hand, like these indirect influences, like which is really the exosystem of like media coverage and, even his relationship with Rose, like the fact that he's everybody sees everything he does. That tension between public and private life is I wouldn't want to carry that.
Yeah, and you could see how much it, like, kills them both, like, often enough.
Oh.
Shane's micro expressions, right? Like, you can see the difficulty, like, if you remember that part where he's watching Ilya win the cup, and he's with all of his friends, he's with his
Uh-huh.
microsystem, and he's supposed
Uh-huh.
to act a certain way, right? And
Uh-huh.
and and he's supposed to act like he hates Ilya. You hate
Yeah.
him the
Mhm.
most, right, Shane? Right? And he's like, "Yeah, of course, I hate him the most." And then when all of his friends kinda, like, move on, drinking and whatever they're doing, you could see in his eyes, like, he's so proud and at the same time
Uh,
so sad that, like, he
yeah.
can't be there on the ice
No.
for Ilya to celebrate with him,
The
and the
biggest
way it
moment.
goes, the biggest moment where, as you know, that's partly why Scott Hunter came out so publicly, because he
Yeah.
was alone. No one else was there on the ice for him,
Yeah.
and then he's like, "Alright, this is my moment," right? And you see
Right.
the same thing when Shane is in episode 4 in that montage in the beginning when they're, like, back and forth. They're on the ice, they're in the private, they're on the ice again, they're in the private. Shane is, doing the commercial, right? And he's texting Ilya, and the producer of the commercial is like, "Hey, Shane, like, come back. Like, we need you in your
Yeah.
public life right now, you know?
Right.
And then he's winning the second cup and he's texting Ilya while everyone is celebrating around him.
Right.
And it's just like you could see that. And then you see a lot of sadness, right? Like when he's finally confronted with it, like you could see all of the crisis that the mesosystem like has created for him. I do
You
like the
know,
idea of this public versus private life, which again, like you
yeah.
said, Tab, like we all have, obviously, but to see it
Yeah.
so displayed in the show was really like really cool.
You know, the way you guys talked about Ilya and Shane, and especially what you said, Diana, about like there's this like sadness that's kind of pulling at them because they can't be public. I'm curious though, Ilya and Shane are essentially in the same sport, the same age, the same level of intensity and success, and both in the closet. Like they're foils for each other in many ways, but their circumstances from 17 on in many ways are like a Venn diagram that overlaps completely. But it's really interesting to me to understand if you two as like experts in these sort of theoretical developmental psychology systems, like is that protective for the other? Like is that
Oh, the
a
fact that they are
protective
this
factor?
literally kind of like the
Yeah.
same, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, right, right, because in so many ways, I see what you're saying, like, it is there's a fundamental story is one of loss, of honesty and being true to your identity, but what about the 2 of them in that, like, as a dyad? Probably so unfair for me to just ask you this, like, question.
What do you
No,
think,
I
Tab?
it's
I
don't
have
not
know.
thoughts. Go
it's not unfair, but I don't think that the fact that they're both in a difficult position, that they both have a similar stress is necessarily protective. I think Ilya has he's got some protective factors that Shane doesn't have, but Ilya doesn't necessarily have the family protective factors. But
Mhm.
I don't necessarily think that just the fact that they're kind of in the same boat is protective.
Well, I don't know, Tab. I'm thinking maybe
You
no,
can disagree. You can disagree. I love it.
no, I
It's
don't
like
know if I'm
a
disagreeing, and
nuance. Yeah, yeah.
I'm not necessarily disagreeing because I do see your point, but I do wonder, and this is not like one of those like misery loves company type of
Mhm,
situations, but
mhm,
I do wonder them having the same secret, that they both know. Not only that it's the same secret, but it's the same secret for the same reasons, right? Like,
mhm.
so I wonder if that is a little bit, like, emotionally protective, right? Like, remember, like, in the very beginning when Shane asks Ilya during their very first kiss, she's like, "Is this your" Ilya's like, "Is this your first time?" And Shane says, "Yes." And then, Shane asks him the same thing, and he tells him about Sasha, and Shane is like, "Well, weren't you, like, worried or something like that?" And he said,
Mhm,
"Well, we had the same secret." And I don't know, like, I wonder if
mhm.
that's kind of, like, it did alleviate Ilya's worries back then that he and this kid, Sasha, who wasn't an elite athlete, right? He was just the coach's son, but they had the same secret. So Ilya does say, like, no, I wasn't too worried because I knew he would hold my secret. And I think in
Mhm.
some ways, Ilya and remember Shane was like, "Don't tell anyone after they first hooked up," and Ilya's like, "Who the fuck am I gonna
Who am
tell,
I gonna
dude? Like, we
tell?
have the
Yeah,
same
right.
secret, right?" And
Secret,
I
yeah.
think that does comfort Shane immediately. It, like, de-escalates him because he was clearly, like, panicked immediately afterwards, and it does kind of, like, de-escalate him and say, "Oh, you're right. We both have the same secret in the same exact environment where it could cost us our entire career."
Yeah, no, now that you say that, I actually do agree that the fact that there's safety in that secret because they have that shared secret, that
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
yeah. Look at
And
us
So
in some
disagree.
I
ways
revised my answer.
yeah, we're learning in real time. I love
We
it.
are, that's
But
the whole point, I love it.
yeah, and I think the thing is, like, in some ways, it allows them to be, like, radically honest.
Alright, so let's talk about the exosystem, that's the next one. Next nesting doll, there we go.
Okay, so can
The
you
in
recap for the newbies in this framework? Yeah.
Yeah, so the micro is like the individual and
Yeah.
immediate influences. The meso, or is the interaction stage,
Mhm,
and then exosystem is like indirect influences. So
mhm,
these are like bigger social structures that
mhm,
impact us indirectly. So And we talked about some of these things already,
Yeah.
like media influences or media coverage, policies of the hockey league, definitely expectations of sponsors, right? Anusha, you mentioned being biracial athlete in a predominantly white sport,
Uh-huh.
and and I don't know. I mean, I know when I was writing the essay, I wondered if there's like if he experiences microaggressions being like one of the only Canadian Asian athletes in the sport. I don't know. I mean, I've definitely heard interviews with the very few Black hockey players that they experience microaggressions. I would imagine that that happens to him too. So these are more like indirect. Also, his relationship with Rose that we talked about, and how like indirectly he might be getting this message that having a hetero relationship is really like what
Uh-huh.
people want to see, or what might get him more sponsorships or whatever. And then we didn't really talk a lot about his neurodivergence, but he's had to figure out how to navigate that space that is not a space that is like readily prepared to support neurodivergence, right? But he's
Uh-huh.
figured it out. Like for whatever reason, like that's a way that he's been able to adapt and figure out how to
Yeah.
be successful in a space where he's different than some of his peers.
Well, it helps if that his skill and his spin and his love is the same thing, hockey.
Yeah.
And
Right, but
it's
But it's not
the
just the
league is not.
hockey.
Yeah.
He's getting sponsorships, right? So like
Mhm.
if he was
yeah.
great at hockey, but he was perceived as like so weird. Like, you know what I mean? Like
Right, right.
they still like him enough. He's got
Yeah.
something going.
Right,
Well,
because
he's
the league
hot.
doesn't, like, accommodate for that, like, they're not
No.
accommodating for his
No.
nor do his sponsors, right? They're just like, "Here they are." I think that, there are 2 narratives that are created for Shane by the media, and I think that's part of the, like, exosystem, right? Like, the fact that, the media creates the rivalry between
Mm.
Ilya and Shane, right? Like, they did this, like, they are
Uh-huh.
to the
Yeah.
outside world, the media has created like all anyone sees are these like two elite athletes
Yeah.
and super competitive, intensely competitive, right? And like the media turns this story into, a story about ambition and rivalry, and they're completely erasing obviously anything, which actually is kind of nice for them in some ways because it gives them cover. But then later at the cottage, you kind of see that because of that, it also is harder for them to even like be seen in public together as friends,
Mhm.
and another one that I thought was interesting in terms of the media creating a narrative is when he starts dating Rose, right? The media constructs this narrative that like he's in a relationship with an actress, the hottest actress in all of Canada, and he's obviously straight and he's fitting the mold of a hockey star. The two people who were like talking, they're like, something about athletes and actors, they just can't keep their hands off each other, and Shane is like kind of glad that he has this like cover again by the media, but also like it does kill him inside.
Well,
And then he
what's
just lucks
also really
out that he
funny.
picked this girl
Yeah.
who's
I
so
know.
great, who turns out to be
Yes.
so
Yeah.
great. Yeah, so the macro system
So
is
over.
literally
Yeah.
like the big picture, like culture, society, what our culture values, right? It's like where in the world are you? If you're in Canada, that may be a safer place to be gay than Russia. Like so that's a big deal. But not just like expectations around sexual orientation, but also around masculinity or race, right? So I don't know, I know what it's like. Oh, you talked about this in one of your episodes,
Mhm.
like the myth of the model minority. What does it
Mhm.
mean to be Asian? That myth of the model minority is, I'm sure it's just as real in Canada as it is in the US, right? So
Mhm.
that's all part of the macro system. So whatever those pressures are to fit a certain mold, that's part of your identity as well. And for a lot of us, that pressure to fit a mold and that's expected of us is part of what makes us who we are. If we decide to conform to that mold, or maybe we like it, maybe that
Mhm.
is what we aspire to be. But definitely Shane is he has privilege around some of these things because
Mhm.
he's a high level athlete. So he's probably considered, masculine and competent and athletic,
Mhm.
those kinds of things. But he's constrained by prevailing views of that intersection of being a pro
Mhm.
athlete and gay, or
Mhm.
being Asian and an athlete, or whatever that is. So that's
Yeah.
really the macro system.
Shane is literally like a walking contradiction of everything that the macro system expects him to be because, hockey is like a predominantly white sport, predominantly straight, at least as far as we know, right? Predominantly hyper masculine and Shane is like, he is, biracial, he's gay, and he is neurodivergent, which doesn't help him with the whole hyper masculinity piece,
Mm-mm.
so he's the system again is contradicting itself in his world.
And I mean, they don't talk about this in the show, but I always think, like, I know he's biracial, but he can pass as white. And so I also think there's some privilege that comes with just his phenotype, because I like,
Mhm.
to me, and except that they identified him as Asian, I probably wouldn't have on my own. And they don't
Yeah.
really talk about that in the show, but I like, for folks who can pass, not that, like, I don't encourage passing. I want people to be who they are, but people who can pass as white are also received differently. So he has a lot of privilege around,
Yeah. He actually does talk about that a little
does he?
bit. Yeah, so when he first meets Rose, I know this show way too well, you guys. This
No,
is
no, it's
scary.
great.
When he first meets Rose, they have this whole
Yeah.
conversation. She does ask him, like, he tells her about when he was like a young kid and he was doing some sort of hockey thing. There were two Asian kids, he said, on that team, and she's like, that must have
Mhm.
been tough for the two of you. And he said, more for him than for me. And he talks
Mm,
about that. He passed more than the other kid because he has a Western last name. And then she's like, you were probably also very good at hockey. And he's like, yes, I was also very good at hockey. So that also helped him. Like the kids were harder on that other kid, the other Asian kid, than on Shane because he was passing more. So that's an
yeah.
interesting point that you bring up because he does mention that. And we're going to talk about like the chrono system, right? Because that is
Mhm.
how do I change over time, right?
It is how you change over time, but it's also a function of, like, at what point in your development do things happen? Right, and
Hmm.
so, like I was saying earlier,
Mhm.
like, if Ilya lost his mother at 25 rather than, like, 8 or 10 or however old he was,
12.
it's a very different developmental trajectory. When you say 12, you're like,
12.
"Excuse me, get the
Yes.
details right," right? But
Please,
but you
please get
think
it
about
right.
that, like, you guys are, we're all parents and we all have kids at different ages, and if when something happens and at a certain age, it's just different, right? Which is why I brought up how young they were when they first start getting notoriety and money. Like,
Mhm.
like, if I made $100,000 when I was 18, there would be signs, and they would not be good, right? Like,
Well,
um, you
Ilya
know,
buys himself a bunch of sports cars, like, that's
right.
his
So you
thing.
could
Mhm.
so you
Yeah.
could see that, like, and that's why I think about Scott a lot too, is like, I feel like Scott, in terms of, like, his age, like, he's a lot older than them in the
Mhm.
series, and I think the way he handles the same the same situations, or very similar situations, are partly a function of his age. Like,
Mhm.
he's getting ready to retire. His career's almost over. He's like, "Mafangul, I'm out." Right? Which might not be
Mhm.
what somebody who's 22 is willing to do when they've got, like, at least, 8-10 years of a career ahead of them.
Right,
So, as societal attitudes evolve, our ability to kind of live more authentically might change. And that, I think
right.
that's kind of what's happening in this series a little bit.
Yeah.
I
I
have
and I
a
think the fact that they meet each other so young at 17 and, like, the frontal lobe is not nearly finished developing yet, right? And they're boys, so it's gonna take a little bit longer. And the fact that they meet, they imprint upon each other at such a young age and they both do say, like, "It's the only person I've loved," right? And I think that
Mhm.
also matters in some ways, like, think about how much your needs and wants and desires and types change the older you get, like, who is to say that they would have been together if they had met each other at 25, and
Mhm.
then they would have fallen in love. So I think that's a really interesting part of the story. A lot of people forget that they're so young when they meet, and when you're that young, love is already, like, so passionate. There's so much lust. Like, all you wanna do is suck each other's faces, at that age, And which is funny because, like, a lot of people are like, "Why are they always having sex?" I'm like, "Dude, that's not what you wanted to do when you were, like, a teenager and, like, you were, like, in lust. Did you guys forget?" Like, so it's interesting of you mentioning that it also matters what age that
Mm,
something happens to you is also important. I think that's something I don't often think about when I think about the system.
mhm.
I love that you brought up the Chronos system because it's like not just change over time. And I know identity isn't static. That's like the theme of this whole. But is there a point where it's like it becomes inflexible? I mean, because sometimes you think of identity as this core element of you. The Bronfenbrenner theories was like a developmental psychology theory, right?
Mhm.
So when I think of developmental psychology, I really think of like children. And certainly this theory could be applied throughout the life, but like where's your identity fixed or is it ever fixed?
I don't think it is ever fixed. I think it's fixed if you dig in. So
Mhm.
and I also think that there's a difference between, like, identity and temperament, and we all have temperament. I This is just my theory about of this. I think temperament is sort of fixed. I think
Yeah.
we could
Mhm.
say that even about each other. Like, you can
Yeah.
hi you it's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater for me to try to be,
Right.
like, real nice, and at some point it just, so
That face gives it all
The
away.
face.
but identity, like every developmental, I shouldn't say every developmental theory, but many developmental theories recognize this ability to, like, revisit, right? So even if you go to, like, Eric Erickson, right, and you work with little ones, so like, so they say from, like, babies 0 to 2 are learning to trust, right? Trust versus mistrust is the conflict. If you resolve that on the mistrust side, it doesn't mean you'll never trust. You could revisit any of those stages. So, but you have to be willing to. You have to be willing to say, I'm having an issue with trust and I'm going to work
Mhm.
on that. Right. And so I think we have some agency in whether or not it's static.
I feel like I fall into the trap of thinking identity is this like static thing, which it's not. It can be fluid in so many ways. And it's like what the system is describing is that it's layered and overlapping, that some things persist throughout. Like I also think that it like gives people that sense of empathy to understand that people aren't just as they are fully formed when they arrive on this planet, that like we are
Mm.
born into these systems that shape us and create who we are from an identity perspective. And for me, I think I couch a lot of my hope and like desire to be a hopeful person and in cynicism because it feels protective. All the time we're sitting here like thinking nothing's going to change, like everything is awful and it's always going to be the way this is, and I think we get stuck in these pathways. But this in this system you think, okay, there is this potential for humans to change if they
Mhm.
were
Mhm.
given like a different like milieu.
Yeah, but to your point, like, everything can change. Like, what identity development and research on identity development tells us is that A, people are really resilient, and B, there's an immense capacity for change. Positive and negative, but actually I
Mhm.
think more positive.
I agree with you, Tap. Like, your identity, I don't think is ever static. Like, you never stop developing who you are as a person. And I think that's why people say, like, be the best version of yourself. And I think part of that is neuroplasticity, right? Like the fact that you can tell your brain to behave a certain way or to believe in certain things, and that's going to come to fruition.
It's so surprising to hear 2 and really like hopeful to hear 2 educators say identity is never fixed. I love that actually, because again, I was like, is that just like pie in the sky kind of dream? Like, but it's actually based in these theories.
We are in, a developmental stage right now that is like, generativity versus stagnation, right? That's Erickson's
Mhm.
stage for us. And so in this part of our life, it's like, well, what are we gonna do? Are we gonna contribute to the world? Are we gonna volunteer? Are we gonna protest? Are we gonna, whatever it is, like,
Mhm.
contribute
Mhm.
in our work life? Or are we gonna become stagnant and just be like, I'm done cooking, right? Like, so the stagnation could influence, like, literally, like, that you get stuck in a certain identity. But if you resolve these conflicts, these identity conflicts in an adaptive way, then you will keep growing and changing. And if you think about Bronfenbrenner, the systems are gonna keep impacting you, right? And so
Mhm.
as the people around you change and things happen and experiences happen, you will probably respond to those. And the
Mhm.
responses to those also are gonna impact your identity.
Mm.
Mhm.
Like, think about bring it back to Shane. Think about when he is confronted with with his hidden identity of being gay by Rose,
Mhm.
right? Where she essentially gives him the space to come out to
Uh-huh.
himself and then
Uh-huh.
to the first person ever.
Uh-huh.
He and we've talked about this a lot, and, many people have, but, like, that could have gone so many different ways. Even if she gave him the space for it, he could have just, like, doubled down and being like, "Nope, I'm
Uh-huh.
good, like, I don't wanna talk about it,"
Yeah.
right? Or he could that whole scene could have gone exactly the way it went, and he could have just been like, "Okay, so one person knows my secret's safe, that's it," right? But what he did with that is actually start changing his place in the world, right?
Mm.
He got a stylist, right? He
Mhm.
said, "I'm gonna be my truest self," like, not
Mhm.
too much publicly because there's still a lot of risk, but I'm gonna get the boy I want, because, like, I've decided, like, I cannot live my life pre this moment. I'm gonna live my life post this moment. He could have chosen to continue doing what he was doing before, but he got a stylist. He came into that Tampa bar to talk to Ilya. He came in with one mission, like, I'm gonna get this boy, right? And his confidence was so clear, like, it was palpable when they were talking at the bar. Like,
Yeah.
he's like, I got a stylist. Rose and I are not compatible. And then later, what is your room number, right? Like, he is
Right.
just like changed, not completely, but significantly from the moment where he came out to himself specifically, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
And
I
so
think that was
that,
the
like, just
first moment where he actually asked for the room. Like, it was a nice
yeah.
flip of the script.
Mhm.
And it
Mhm.
was also the first moment where you saw Ilya, like, on kind of on the back foot of this relationship.
Yeah.
Like, he
And
didn't know what was
also,
Mm.
like,
going on.
Tab, to your point, they are also older now, right? So there's definitely a lot more maturity and a
Uh-huh.
lot more just confidence, life
Mhm.
experience, whatever it may be. And then, he also, not only does he, like, you have this confidence where he's like pressing on Illy, like, stop being an asshole. I know you feel this too. Like, let's not play these games anymore. Like, he drives that, which is
Mhm.
before, like, they never did that, like Ilya kind of drove that a little bit. But so yeah, like, this one moment with Rose flipped the script for him, and then they
Yeah.
ended up at the cottage.
And then
Mhm.
speaking of, like, how development can keep happening over time, like, I wonder about Shane's mom. Like, Shane's mom has to, like, her whole identity as a mom and, like, who my kid is changes as a re
Mm,
and his dad too, as a result of now learning about Shane. So
mhm.
they've gotta adapt. So their identity is going to evolve as a function of learning something new about their kid.
Yeah.
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 And I think if our last episode was about how women are like facing so
Trench
much
foot.
loss in trench foot of their fundamental identity as a woman is being like, is like being chipped away. I think this one is I mean, it sound like a broken record. This one is one of hope. Like, this is it's the future. It gives you this idea that, like, you're never done learning, right? But
Mhm.
your brain is also never done, like, developing a different perspective or being capable of doing more, or being more empathetic or understanding another one's perspective, as long as you are given the milieu that allows that, right? And that's what,
Mhm.
in so many ways, like representation matters. Like
Mm.
all of that matters. These external things, they matter in how you view yourself, and that only that can drive the change. If you're constantly exposed to the same thing over and over, like
Yeah.
you're not going to change. So either the world has
Right.
to change around you or you have to seek it out. So
Yeah.
Mhm.
both of those
And
feel
you all talked
hopeful.
about you talked about this, like, a couple, like, way episodes ago about the way in which this show has flipped the script on, like, expectations, and I think that another important aspect of the show is that it's normalized adaptive coping, right? Because
Mm.
maladaptive coping is really sexy and lots of people watch it because we're so used to watching people crash and burn
Mm,
and make bad decisions
yeah.
and relationships fall apart, and right? So I loved your
You
episode when
expect
you
it.
talked right, when you talked about this, but this series has normalized adaptive coping. It has shown
Mhm.
us, like, a possibility that's still sexy and fun to watch and engaging, but it's like, here's what's possible when we support one another.
Tab, I love this framework, as do you. And for me, because it's like, you know, what it does is it does for Shane anyway. Like it takes his story or all the, characters in the story and it makes it feel like very deeply personal and very deeply universal, right? Like yes, you have these fictional characters, Shane, for example, biracial, gay, autistic, elite hockey player, right? But like the architecture of how he became who he is, the family, the culture, the institutions, the passage of time, that's all of our stories. That's everybody's stories,
Mhm.
right? So like I
Yeah,
I
yeah,
love that
absolutely.
we're all being shaped by these systems. And it's interesting to me to take someone like Shane or Ilya, which we'll do, and like put them in there to see how universal it really is.
Well,
Yeah.
thank
Well,
you.
Well, thank you so much for coming and talking
thank
about this
you.
and for writing the
Yeah.
article. We will link it and really appreciate you joining us today, Dr. Tab. The
Thank
pleasure is all
you.
ours.
Wow, that was really fascinating stuff. First of all, I'm really glad that I read up a little bit on this ecological theory before, because just really fascinating to
I
listen
know.
to
I love
Dr.
it.
Tab's. I don't know why I keep calling her Dr. Tab, but
I right? Like, I don't think I've ever done that in any real
never. We
setting,
have
but
never actually called her that, but it just rolls off the tongue. Okay,
it really
so
does. It really
yeah.
does. And it really was a really fascinating conversation. As you know, I love this framework,
Mhm.
and I cannot wait to do this for Ilya next week.
Mhm. Oh, so we are doing this again next week. I
We are
love
doing
it.
this again. Yep.
But from a different sort of point of view, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think Tab has a little bit of a different framework, but I'm excited for that one for
Mhm.
Ilya.
Okay. So let's talk about our sunshine for this week. So,
Mhm.
in honor of
Yeah.
Bronfenbrenner, I strengthened all my bonds across my microsystem this weekend.
Mm.
So many groups of friends, family, my parents, my kids, my husband. It was my birthday, so I got to see all sorts of people. It was just a really beautiful weekend of love. There
Aw,
you go.
well, listen, I know I've said happy birthday to you a million times already, but once again, happy birthday.
Oh, well, I never get tired of hearing that.
No, you don't. Well, you know what? I'm gonna steal your birthday,
Mhm,
sunshine,
mhm,
and only because we were celebrating together this
mhm,
weekend, and we have spent the last 2 weekends celebrating our friends' 50th birthdays. And
mhm.
so our microsystems are definitely strengthening
Yes,
all
they are.
throughout the weeks. And last weekend we were at a 70s disco party. This
Mhm,
weekend we were at a 1920s speakeasy party. So we're
mhm,
just hopping through the decades and
mhm.
we're having a great time. And in Heated Rivalry, we're like in the early to mid 2000s. So let's go.
So
We're just
here's
all
the
over the
time
place.
travel, I guess.
Yeah, our moment of sunshine is time travel.
Yeah, there you go. I love it.
Next week on Everyone Deserves Sunshine, we're talking about Ilya's identity. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you want to say hi to the girls in the crease, find us on Instagram, Facebook, and Threads at Everyone Deserves Sunshine.
Or email us at everyonedeservessunshine@gmail.com. New episodes drop on Mondays.
See you then.